Good morning, everyone. My name is Carin. I am the Chief Diversity Officer for a company called Workday. Workday is a cloud software company. And I am joined by my wonderful partner in crime here, Cate Prescott, who is the Chief People Officer at NI. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So today we're going to actually talk about belonging. So I have a very important question for all of you. Has anyone ever felt like they didn't belong? Show of hands. Marginalized, like you don't belong, like an outsider. Has anyone ever made someone else feel like they don't belong? Yeah, we've all done that as well. I have as well, and I want to actually start there. Several years ago, it was actually many, many years ago, I was at a sales conference, and I was in a room of about 300 people, okay? I was one of about 10 women. I'm one of 2 African Americans, and I'm the only black woman in the room that day. And the topic of conversation just happens to be diversity. So I remembered, and this was way before I started doing diversity work, I remembered sitting in the front row, steam coming out of my ears, as I sat there looking at a white male executive talk to me about diversity. And I sat there thinking, how can this guy say anything of relevance to me about diversity? So I sat there, I'm a very curious person, so during a break I walked up to him, his name was Mike, and I said, Mike, I'm really sorry, but I can't receive your message, because as I was sitting there looking at him, it was hitting me in the gut, like I literally had shut off everything that this guy could completely have taught me that day. So I walked up to him during a break and I said, Mike, I'm really sorry, but I can't receive your message. And he said, why not? And I said, because of what you look like. And he said, I'm gay. And it was the first time that unconscious bias really hit me upside the head. But I'll tell you, I really didn't understand the impact of that story until I got home that evening. I was about to sit down and have dinner, and I burst into tears. Because what I had realized is that what I had done to Mike, people had been doing to me my entire life. They had been judging me simply by what I look like. And I, in turn, had started to do it to other people, right? I share that story because it was literally that day that I told myself I would never make another person feel undervalued simply by what they look like. It is the reason that I do this work. It's the reason that I believe I am on this earth, to tell stories about the importance of connection and belonging and what it means to really appreciate and engage with people on a very personal level. So I want to talk about this a little bit. So a few years ago, so I've been doing diversity work for about 15, 20 years. And a few years ago, we introduced this new term into the arena of DEI, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. It was this term called belonging. And for me, I was like, that's it. It's the missing piece of diversity and inclusion. It's like there was something, I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I knew that there was something that was missing. And I knew, when I heard belonging, I was like, yes, that's it. I now have the words to think about what this means. So I decided to go on a journey, but my journey started off with trying to understand and figure out what was the secret sauce around belonging. Because now that we had the diversity, equity, inclusion, the belonging, we had all the pieces that we needed. And so I figured if I could actually go out and solve for the world and figure out what belonging was, I would transform corporations. I would transform company cultures in terms of how employees were engaging. So I sought out to do this, and I will tell you that is where I made my first mistake. And I want to talk about some lessons that I learned along this journey, because they were actually really important. The first one is I believe there are 5 conditions that must be in place for most of us to feel like we belong, and I'll talk about those 5 things in a minute. Belonging is personal to each one of us. This is why when I started out trying to solve for belonging for the entire world, I figured that I couldn't, because belonging is different for each and every one of us. What makes me feel like I belong doesn't necessarily make you or you feel like you belong. So some of the things that make me feel like I belong is when I can go into the workplace and I can sport my braids one day, and I can come into the workplace the next day wearing my natural hair, and people not look at me like I'm an alien or like they have never seen me in their lives before, right? All of a sudden I've changed my appearance, and people are like, who are you, right? And they're afraid to approach you. Well, if you are afraid to approach me simply because I changed my appearance, that certainly isn't going to make me feel like I belong. Another thing that might make me feel like I belong is when I go into an executive meeting, it's a hot day, and I roll up my sleeves and my tattoo is showing. my tattoo is very personal to me, right? A lot of people have lots of tattoos. This is super personal to me, and I don't want to hide this part of who I am, right? Another thing that might make me feel like I belong is when there has been a traumatic event in my community and I walk into the office the next day and one of my colleagues says to me, "How are you doing? Is there anything that I can do to help support you?" Those are things that make me feel like I belong, but they may not be things that make you feel like you belong, right? And so one of the important things is being able to define what belonging means to each of us. And you need to be able to understand yourself to be able to do that. Okay? The next thing is belonging is a two-way street. I talked about those 5 basic conditions. If those things are in place, you as an individual have to lean into belonging as well. You have to be able to tell your colleagues what belonging means for you, and I'll talk about that a little bit. The power is in your hands, and what I mean by that is if you are in a position where you are feeling like you don't belong, the power really does reside within you. And I'll tell you, and I'll give you some tips and tools for actually how to change status quo. And then the last thing, which obviously is what we're going to talk about, is if you want people to thrive, create the conditions for belonging. So these are what I am calling the 5 tenets of belonging, and I am doing them through something that I am calling peace. And this really resonated with me as I was thinking about preparing for a TED Talk on belonging, which is where some of this content is coming from. But for me, if peace is not in play, it's really difficult for most of us to feel like we belong. And let me talk about each one of these. Psychological safety. When we are talking about psychological safety, the most important thing about psychological safety, which we learned in the session earlier today, is trust. It's your way to build trust. It's safety. It's security. It's where your curiosity stems as well, where that questioning comes in and where you don't just jump to conclusions about the people that you're interacting with. Empathy is the second one. If we haven't learned anything over the last couple of years, we all must lead with empathy and compassion. We must all have that as a very strong tool in our toolkit as we are leading other people and as we are engaging with other people. So that empathy, that care and compassion is really important. The next one is feeling accepted, and accepted for who you are as an individual. And this is really about being your authentic self, being your authentic best self. And what I mean by that is a lot of companies are still talking about bringing your whole self to work. We don't talk about bringing our whole selves anymore. And the reason is because my whole self, there are parts of my whole self that may not align with my company's values. And when it comes between my personal values and my company's values, one of them has to stay tall, and it's my company's values, right? So if I want to be nasty, mean Carin Taylor on every single Monday, right, from 10 to 12, my colleagues should not have to be exposed to that, because that is not what's contributing to making a great culture within our company, right? And so people need to be able to be their authentic best selves and not come into an environment where they are covering a majority of the time, okay? The next one is connection, and connection is about both connection to people as well as purpose. Right? It's got to be both of those things. You have to be connected to both of those things. And then the last one is feeling embraced. And a lot of people are like, embraced? What do you mean by that? Think about when you get this warm embrace from someone that really loves you. You feel valued and respected and appreciated for your contributions or from that person. These things, if these things are in place, you can actually feel like you belong. One of the things that I wanted to just kind of introduce into this conversation as well is owning your own sense of belonging. And what I mean by that, imagine this. Imagine that you're in a room. Imagine that there are 20 seats around the table, but there's only one seat left. You walk into that room, and the 2 people next to you say, "Hi, how are you? Welcome to the conversation. I look forward to hearing your voice in this conversation. What do you do for a living? Why are you here? What are your passions about?" And you start to engage, and you start to feel that level of energy when you feel like you belong, like you're connecting with other people, right? Now imagine that you walk into that same room, that same one chair is there, you sit down, and no one says anything to you. No one looks at you. No one cares to hear your opinion. Let's say that you're the only woman, you're the only man, you're the only black person, you're the only gay person, you're the only person with a disability, you're the only immigrant, you're the only, and you are sitting in that room, in that chair by yourself. Think about the isolation that you may feel as an individual sitting there, right? And so what I share that because when I say that your sense of belonging is in your own hands, what I mean by that is you can change the status quo, okay? If those 5 things, if peace is at play, you can actually change the environment in the room. Because if there's psychological safety and there is trust, you can say, I'm not feeling it today. I just came off of a really traumatic experience last night, and my energy level is like 2. I can't engage with you. I'm not feeling good today. You can actually bring that into the conversation, and you will be in an environment where you are trusted, where people care for you, and you are then able to lean in differently. So when you walk in and you sit at that table, if no one speaks to you, if peace is at play, you can lean over to that other person and say, how are you today? What's your name? Here's who I am. I would love to hear your voice just a little bit more. So if peace is at play and you have psychological safety, empathy, compassion, acceptance, you feel embraced, you can actually lean in and tell people how you're feeling so that you can actually change the way that you show up, which will be infectious to how other people show up as well. So even though you may be feeling like, oh, this environment, this isn't for me, you have choice. And at the end of the day, if those things are not in place for you, guess what? You still have choice. You can walk out the door, right? You can leave the company. You can go and do something different perhaps. And I know that that's not always easy, and we're not always privileged enough to be able to just walk out if we're not happy. But I guarantee you, if those things are in place, find a company where these things are at place so that you can be successful. In closing, if you want people to thrive and be at their best, it's simple. Create the conditions for belonging. And I'll just leave you all with this before I invite Cate into the conversation, and that is, think about what you can do to create this sense of belonging. I, as the Chief Diversity Officer of my company, our diversity strategy is built on something that we call VIBE, value, inclusion, belonging, and equity for all. We've built a whole structure around how we vibe in the workplace so that everyone can feel and contribute the best and that they can thrive in our workplace.
So real quick question, did you, in having these conversations, kind of tagging onto her question, was there training around how to have courageous conversations? Because sometimes, sometimes they come, at least for us, they come in roundabout ways, right? So I call them a lot of babies, right? So I have a lot of interns that I shepherd and kind of help, along the way or early in career. And so they usually come to me, right? But our normal protocol is actually ER is the next step. Mm-hmm. And so, it's always a thing when ER gets involved. And so do you all encourage them to go, traditional route ER and then there's a restorative process that way? Or are you asking them just to lean in and just talk directly to your leader?
A little bit of both, a little bit of all of the above. One of the things that we are actually just now putting in place is a coaching line for those issues that are not quite ER issues, but they're, I have this issue, I know something's going on, but I don't quite want to go to ER yet, right? We are creating a warm line specifically for that reason. So employees have a place to go in dialogue, or even people leaders have a place to go in dialogue and get some feedback and coaching to have some of those kind of difficult conversations. That's how we're addressing it.
Yeah, and very similar. We've had some situations where we've used a third party for a restorative conversation and process to just kind of take it out of individuals within the organisation. We purposely don't have employee relations because that is the kind of stick. We use our HR function without kind of that piece. And we also use our IRGs. So they're a source of a lot of support for our employees, and also they help to bridge the conversations that need to have sometimes that the individual feels like they can't have on their own, or that a manager needs to have but doesn't know how to have it. So we've worked really closely from a training and leadership point of view with our IRGs to help to equip them to also be able to help us in that context.
So were there any significant changes, and I know at Workday there certainly were, but any significant changes at NI after George Floyd maybe one or two things that you guys said, this thing was super impactful for us?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely would say our inclusion series came from that. I think the other thing that was different, so we'd gone from a founder to a CEO who was there for a couple of years, did the specifics that we wanted him to do, and then transitioned to another CEO. So we were on our third CEO in 45 years, and he had grown up throughout the company. So he was a long-time NIA. And his tenure started in February as COVID hit. So he got a very rough ride to kind of start with, but we had to think about different ways of communicating for him. And we had to think about what his role was in relation to this, because I think from what's happened, the social agenda that we have as a society, I think the employee and the employer relationship is fundamentally changed now, and the expectation of a CEO, the fact that our employees want our CEO to talk about these issues. They want to be a voice. They want to have a trusted person. They want someone to have their back. And so we were trying to kind of navigate all of that to figure out how to do that. And then we were at the dinner table last night, I think, and Chris, who's the CEO of Indeed, was talking a little bit about this, and he was talking about, I'm a CEO, I'm not expected to say things on everything, and I don't, I can't say everything, so I have to kind of pick and choose. What we set up was what we call our Brands Taking a Stand team. And so that composed of HR, marketing, our PR department, but also some of our IRGs. Our IRG leaders, and so when something comes up within the world, and we think we might need to comment on it, that group of people sit down and talk about what the right thing to say is, or is it to say something, and then we go back to our corporate impact pillars and our values, and we use those as a way of being able to determine whether or not it's something that we can talk about with passion in the work context, as opposed to as a personal thing that we might want to say something about. So that came from the last kind of 2 years as a different way of being able to interact with our employees and with the wider world.
Who did you bring together on that team again?
So there's a HR leader, there's marketing, so that's from a brand point of view, there's PR, we have a legal person in there, we have someone who looks after our kind of political side of things, and we have our IRG leaders. So if it's an issue from an LGBTQ situation, then our IRG leader will be part of that conversation. If it's something to do with our Black Inclusion Network, then the leader of that will be at that table, and they'll talk about it. And what's great about that is they have a really robust conversation, and sorry, our DEI leaders in there as well. And there are different spectrums that everybody comes from, and so what they do is they actually record the not record it, but they write the conversation in that they say, hey, here's all the views that happened in that dialogue, and here's the recommendation that we have. That then goes to our impact committee, and we 9 times out of 10 will take the represented view and the recommendation. But sometimes we'll take a look at that dialogue and we'll say, hey, that person over here that had that conversation, we need to dig into that. That was a point that person felt strongly about, and we need to understand more about that. And so that gives us a chance again to do more interaction and really understand what's at the heart of some of the comments that are coming out from that team.
We did a after the murder of George Floyd, we ended up implementing something that we called an accelerator team. And the accelerator team was unique because it was about a little over 20 resources that had come together from all over the company. So literally from engineering, products, HR, marketing, the entire organization, where we had literally 23 people who took a year pause in their career. They all transferred over to the DEI team, and they helped us accelerate our movement around DEI. One of the most phenomenal things, in 15 months, we saw our Black representation increase by 47%. It was significant. We did, and that wasn't the only thing we did. We did education. It was big on education, training, creating different processes for our underrepresented our represented employees. We looked at succession plan. We looked at the whole gamut of things. And what we saw was we said, okay, we're going to prioritize these things over the next year, and we are going to really double down on what the organization is going to do, and that's where we saw a ton of progress. But the good thing is that it then started the momentum, and the momentum is still going, and that's how we were able. But that pause with our entire executive team saying, this is critical, we will give you people from every organization to participate, that was a huge deal breaker in terms of some of the progress that we've been able to make.
So the two ways of the employee versus the organization. Employees are part of the organization, but there is something about if a company is at a pivoting point and is trying to change what it wants to be.
Yeah.
That involves making a mindset shift and a culture change.
Yeah.
And that shakes the foundational belonging sense that employees have that we need to somehow break the mold and then reestablish.
Yeah.
How do you navigate that?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, the first thing is conversation, because it gets really, really difficult. So when George Floyd happened, one of the things that really happened was as we accelerated work for certain groups, other groups felt like they were not being included, right? Think about the AAPI hate. Think about the issues with the Jewish synagogues, right? Think about Black Lives Matters, right? And those are very specific things for very specific communities. And when you are not a part of that community, you feel excluded if there's so much talk on those things and there's no talk about you. We certainly saw that when AAPI hate came up. They're like, we want you to address this issue like you did the Black Lives Matter issue. Right? And I think it just has to be a balance. You have to understand the issues. Companies have to lean into having that dialogue and understanding. And the employee voice in that situation becomes critical. The employees they are much more connected to the community issues that are happening within their community. And that's how we have to get that feedback from them to be able to address those issues. And the only way we can do it is by dialogue. We've got to open these lines of communication.